So in a desert climate, what time of the day would you normally go to the well to draw water? I mean, it's probably not the hottest time of the day. And so why was that woman there at noon? And it speaks volumes to who she was. She was someone not welcome in the cool of morning. Someone on the outside, rejected, ostracized. Someone whose hard life others judged. At least that's how I see it, because here's the thing. We can hear the words of Jesus that she has had 5 husbands and was now living with a man who was not her husband and think he was judging her. That's the often traditional interpretation, and I didn't have a conversation with Artsel in advance for her to comment that this was an immoral woman. That is how many scholars interpret this, and in fact, male scholars have written things like this about her. She exhibits a dubious lack of morals. She is aberrant. Her sexual behavior is inappropriate. Where is that in the text? And one commentator wrote that she's a 5-time loser and a tramp. These men reveal more about their attitudes toward women than anything they can possibly find in the actual text itself. I mean, let's think about the life that she would have had in the time that she lived. I mean, as a woman, what kind of power would she have had? For example, even if she had wanted to, she couldn't have initiated a divorce with 1, let alone 5 men. And if it had been adultery, the man would have been in the locker room being patted on the back, right, while others are out assembling a pile of stones to throw at her. Well, maybe every single one of the men died and people thought she was cursed. You know, I immediately think of the woman who was forced to marry 7 brothers, one right after the other after each man died, like a piece of property passed down. So to recognize that the woman at the well had been married 5 times means that we must realize, sympathize with what a hard life she must have had. I mean, imagine a life filled with that much grief. A life of being abandoned. The hunger inherent in such instability and thirst. Literal thirst. As she did everything she could to survive, including living with a man who wasn't her husband. And what did she get for all that? Scholars calling her a loser. And women who didn't invite her to join them in the early morning as they laughed and shared stories on their way to the well. Why was she at the well at noon? Well, not only her exclusion, but the time of day also reveals the contrast between her and Nicodemus. Nicodemus is a respected member of the religious establishment. And in the chapter right before this story, Nicodemus came to Jesus in the middle of the night. Didn't want anyone to see him talking with Jesus. And to his credit, he went to see Jesus with an open mind, but he couldn't comprehend the idea that he must be born from above, or anew, or again. And he walked back into the night, unconvinced. But by the dazzling light of the noonday sun, this woman with no name, no power, and not only that, a Samaritan, a person of a hated and despised people, regardless of whether she had a, quote, past, she not only immediately understood who Jesus was, this woman at the well raced back to the village to tell the other people this good news. And do you realize that makes her the first preacher of the gospel? Yes. Now, it wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't an accident that Jesus happened to come across her. On this trip from Galilee to Judea, he chose to go directly through Samaria. So imagine you're going from San Diego to San Francisco. Wouldn't make sense to go to Las Vegas first. That is, unless you're trying to avoid Los Angeles. Not because of the traffic, but because you despise the people of LA. To get from Judea to Galilee, it would make geographic sense to take a direct route, but Jews would travel all the way around it. They hated each other. You remember the story of the Good Samaritan? It's so notable because there was no such thing as a good Samaritan. Nothing good could ever come out of Samaria. I mean, it's like hearing the story of the good smuggler or the good white supremacist. I mean, it's going to get your attention. And why did Jews and Samaritans hate each other so much? Well, I started to try to explain that, and it just took too long. So all I want to say is, just take my word for it. They hated each other with intensity. And yet, despite this animosity, or with Jesus, maybe more likely, because of this animosity, he chose to travel right through it. Jesus explained to Nicodemus in that after dark meeting just verses before that God so loved the world, and then immediately put that famous John 3:16 passage into practice. Samaria was the beginning of the world, and this was just the beginning. And giving the message to this particular woman, by doing that, he exemplified, or rather amplified, by telling this woman, I am. It's extraordinary. It wasn't a coincidence. She was exactly the kind of person he was looking for. So remember, Nicodemus didn't understand. Not even the disciples understood. But Jesus engaged in a serious theological conversation with her, treating her with respect. And she not only understood, again, she raced back to transform the lives of the very villagers among whom she was an outcast. Get that? The way she was treated? She gave him this most precious news. You know, this isn't just a nice little story. This story destroys the labels we attach to people. It explodes previous and preconceived notions. This story tears down walls. It's a blast that flings open the door for anyone who has ever felt judged and left out, shut out. Anyone who has ever felt excluded is provocatively welcomed by Jesus, who offers living water to all of us. Again, the statement Jesus made about her 5 husbands wasn't a dig at her past. He showed he understood her hard life, and he offered a healing balm. Like the choir sang, there is a balm in Gilead to heal the wounded soul. Now, if you were listening to the words of the choir, or the traditional words, it's sin sick, right? To heal the sin sick soul. But is this the same sort of sin sickness the woman was accused of? Is it the reason she went to the well alone at noon? Or the reason she was called a tramp with an aberrant sex life, i.e., sin sick? People do this to one another. Why must people be so cruel? I mean, right now in legislatures across the country, the lives of transgender and non-binary people are being debated like never before. Just this morning, I read about a weekend conference where it was said that transgenderism must be eradicated. Harsh words. The United Church of Christ reported on Friday that as of March 3rd, there have been 385 anti-LGBTQ bills introduced. The highest number ever introduced in a single legislative season, with 108 of them aimed at ending gender-affirming health care, affecting 54,000 youth, about whom the same kinds of things have been said as they were about the woman at the well, right? Rejected, ostracized, wounded, but instead called, among other things, sinful, aberrant, morally dubious, and a danger to our kids. Well, let me introduce you to a woman in Samaria with 5 husbands and now living with a man who's not her husband. Not a single word in this text about, if you repent, I'll give you some of this living water, because there was no forgiveness needed. She wasn't a tramp. She was a woman with a hard life. No forgiveness for that needed. So instead of assigning labels and inciting violence, the churches should be offering the living water of understanding for how hard life can be when you live under judgment for things over which you have no control. Do we try to understand? Or assign to people some sort of moral deficiency? The parallels here, to me, are extraordinary, as well as just this example of cruelty, the religiously based cruelty. But there is a balm in Gilead for the wounded soul. Not the pointed at sin sick, but the wounded, for all wounded by religion. Perhaps you've been wounded by religion because of divorce and then excluded from communion. Or maybe you've been judged for having doubts, or that you or your children weren't baptized, or you or a loved one are LGBTQ, or because you've been looked down upon for whatever reason, because for some reason religious people can come up with a lot of reasons to judge. Or are you a woman who has been barred from preaching the good news of Jesus, who offers the kind of living water which will never make us thirst again? So this living water, I asked our lunch and lectionary friends on Thursday, what is living water? And Marla said it's the love of God. And others describe living water as something having motion, right? Water moves. What's the opposite of living water? Stagnant and dank, smelly, unfit to drink water. I think of this like faith. Think of a stagnant faith or one that is living. You kind of know. Even if you don't know why, you kind of know the difference between a stagnant faith and a living faith. Because a living faith moves and breathes and changes course. Surprises you. A living faith says God is still speaking. A stagnant faith may counterpropose that God has spoken. Period. What does the UCC say to that? Never place a period where God has placed a comma. So is your faith alive, or has your faith stagnated? A living faith, like water, is always in motion. It's changing. It's always changing, and often in ways you can't control. Isn't that great? Because why would you want to control? We are people of a faith that's in motion, living water. And sometimes water can only be found in the springs below the surface, and you can't see it, and you kind of get afraid maybe, or fear that your faith has disappeared because you haven't seen it for a while. It's still there, right? Springs can't necessarily be seen, but they're still there, nourishing, waiting for us to draw from it. Or maybe our prayer to God is to stir the waters. Careful what you pray for. The woman at the well is an inspiration. Just like our national UCC leaders said to trans and non-binary youth on Friday, you are a beloved child of God, created with intention, no accident, vibrant love. And within your body rests a sacred offering of God's multitude. What a great line. Sacred offering of God's multitude. We see you. You belong. As Danielle read at the beginning of the service, that poem, hear Jesus say to you, I'd give you a drink, a warm cup of tea with lemon and mint. I'd give you a confetti cannon, roses from the garden, my favorite sweatshirt, a bed to lay in, homemade bread, a hand to hold. I'd give you my full attention. I'd give you my phone and say, here, put your number in. I'd give you the melody line, a standing ovation, a sense of security. I'd give you anything and everything if it made you believe that you are enough. Amen.